So first is a general question. How do you describe the general exigence, that is, the problem, the need for Holocaust education in colleges and universities?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And let me begin by saying that part of the reason the Holocaust belongs in universities is because it was committed by university-educated people. The perpetrators were university-educated. Let me prove the point with 3 or 4 simple illustrations. Mark Twain once said, "There truth lies in statistics." On January 20th, 1942, there was a meeting of 15 men around a table in a beautiful seaside resort called Wannsee. They were there not to make the decision to commit the Holocaust. That decision had what they called the final solution. Decision was already made. They were there essentially to make sure that each of their agencies were engaged in it and were part of bringing all of the different organizations together. In post-9/11 language, they were there to connect the dots. 8 of those men had doctorates. They were what you would call the best and the brightest in my Vietnam language. They were the best and brightest of German society. The day they met, 4 out of 5 Jews who were to die in the Holocaust were still alive. 15 months later, 4 or 5 were already dead. So the question becomes, 8 guys with doctorates of 15 people, most of whom, if not almost all of whom, were college graduates, were there. The tipping point, the turning point. The perpetrators of the Holocaust were also doctors. At Auschwitz, for example, the selection, the choice who should live and who shall die was made at the ramp, always by a physician. Gassing did not begin with Jews, it began with, to use non-PC language, mentally retarded, physically infirm, emotionally disturbed, congenitally ill Germans, non-Jews, were an embarrassment to the myth of Aryan supremacy. Virtually the entire psychiatric profession in Germany was involved in the decision. There were 2 psychiatrists who refused to participate. One of them, ironically, was Karl Bonhoeffer, the father of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the very great Protestant theologian. Psychiatric society were perpetrators. I will say a sentence, but I want you to make me one promise, which is you only quote the whole sentence, not half of the sentence. The Nazis committed no crime, the Nazis broke no law. They used the law as the instrumentality of committing the crime. Remember, I want both sentences, your promise. They broke no law. They used the law as the instrumentality of committing the crime, which meant that the entire process of killing took place under the rubric of the legal profession and the legal establishment. Justices were implicated, judges were implicated, the legal profession was implicated, the very cornerstone of society. Another example, just to again say why the university. In any list of the greatest philosophers of the 20th century, you'd have to list Martin Heidegger. Scale of 1 to 10, 12, 14, 16, one of the very greats. Martin Heidegger, ironically, was in his personal life not an anti-Semite. He was the doctoral student, his most famous doctoral student was Hannah Arendt. He treated her with respect and dignity. They indeed had a love affair, which was a love affair brought about less by physical attraction than by the sheer magnitude of mental attraction. 2 very great minds. He became rector of the University of Freiburg, used his stature as the preeminent philosopher of his generation to remove Jewish faculty and to exclude Jewish students. Without being a personal anti-Semite, he came to regard Nazism as the embodiment of the German spirit and the fulfillment of his own work. And you have to ask, how can the best and the brightest, the university-educated people, perpetrate this crime? And consequently, one of the real implications of Holocaust education in the university is we hope that when we give you an education and we allow you to learn, we enable you to learn, we empower you to learn, we excite you to learn about the great traditions of the human intellectual tradition. We dream that that's also going to have an impact on your moral character, on the very nature of your spiritual being, your moral being, your ethical being. And we have to teach you this event because we don't want to create educated monsters. We don't want to use the sophisticated tools that you have with Western intellectual tradition to enable you to perpetrate a crime, rather to empower you to be able to find the modalities of resistance and not getting in there to begin with. I can illustrate it in a very particular way. I taught, as you said, at Georgetown University. One of the things that happened at Georgetown University, I taught a course on the Holocaust. And I was also always afraid that there was some son of a foreign dictator who was taking the course, who was sitting there taking notes and say, you know, the Germans made the following 3 mistakes. And if I don't make the following 3 mistakes, I can perpetrate a genocide without consequences and without defeat. So our moral core, the dream of almost all of your professors, is that you get an education not only to expand the mind, but to deepen your very sense of being and the very content of the ethical character of who you are.
That really leads to, I'm going to jump down to question number 6, because that I'd say you had a major role in the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in a book entitled Preserving Memory by Edward Linenthal, the struggle to create America's Holocaust Museum. Linenthal reports the mission of the USHMM in the minds of the design team is to inform the moral imagination. And I wonder if you could talk a bit about the difference between a museum and a memorial, and looking particularly for the discussion of the cognitive and the affective and empathic. So elaborate on what you're
I trust you're here for a week, because let me be brief. Let me talk personally first. I had an incredible piece of personal luck. And sometimes when you think you're smart, you're much better off if you're also lucky. And you have to be smart enough to take advantage of your luck. I began work in 1979 on the President's Commission on the Holocaust, and after that was done, I left. And then they brought in museum professionals, and I had the great fortune from their misfortune, they failed about 7 times. So they then scratched their head and said, maybe we should go the opposite way. Instead of getting museum people and teaching them the Holocaust, maybe we should get somebody who knows the Holocaust and teach them museums. And since they had failed 7 times, if you fail once, it's the other guy's fault. You fail twice, it's the other guy's fault. You fail 3 times, you begin to wonder, could it be me? You fail 7 times, you begin to wonder, could it be me or could it be the mission, or are we looking in the wrong way? So that's the personal luck, and then I came back, and I came back essentially to fill a monumental spiritual void that was created when Elie Wiesel became a Nobel Prize winner and had to leave as chairman, and everybody presumed he would create the museum, but he had international responsibilities that didn't give him time. So it fell to me, not that I'm Elie Wiesel, but sometimes lesser people can, with the cooperation of colleagues and staff and learning and growing tangibly, can really do some enabled to be done some very great things. And I say this because you're students, you're thinking about what correct direction your career might take, and think of it as sometimes you got to be ready to jump and to risk it all. We had a struggle. President Carter's nominated us to create and tasked us to create an appropriate national memorial to the Holocaust. And we said that the best type of, that a memorial only functions really well for that generation that knows why it's memorializing something. Unless you tell the story to a new generation, the memorial doesn't quite work. Let me make it vivid to you in a different way. I was in Oklahoma City a week ago Tuesday. In Oklahoma City, they asked a very interesting question. They asked all visitors, where were you on April 19th, 1995? And for a decade, everybody in Oklahoma City and in Oklahoma and in the region could answer that question clearly, vividly, directly. Just like my generation could answer, where were you on November 22nd, 1963? And your older people than you could answer very easily, where were they on 9/11? Not a moment you forget. Everybody could answer that. You could wake us in the middle of the night and ask the question we all knew. Their problem in Oklahoma City was that lots of visitors to the Oklahoma City Museum. Where was I on April 19th, 1995? I wasn't. Not only that, I wasn't even the flirtatious glimmer in my mother's eye or my father's eye, because I was born many years thereafter. My parents didn't even know each other. And consequently, we decided we needed a museum to tell the story. And then, and only then, could you enter the memorial. Contrast that with Israel's memorial at Yad Vashem. Israel's memorial at Yad Vashem is very different because they could create the memorial separate from the museum, because for 50 years, lots of people who knew what the event was, and they wanted a memorial, and they didn't need the museum, they knew the story itself. A new generation has arisen that knew not the Holocaust, and therefore they need the museum and the memorial. Now, what did we do in a museum that was interesting? A normal museum tells the story of the artifacts it collects. If I go to LACMA and I give LACMA a Picasso section, if I give them 10 Picassos, they'll develop the Picasso section. If I gave them 10 Rembrandts, they'd develop a Rembrandt section, and then include some Dutch masters to tell the story of what they show. We said that a museum should be a storytelling institution. What are the mechanisms of storytelling in the modern world? And by the way, storytelling, you folks should know, as we do. What is a storytelling book that's lasted a pretty long time? What? The Bible, right? What are the Gospels? 4 stories on the life of Jesus, right? They tell a story. Storytelling is a way of what? Transmitting memory, transmitting values. And it's a very particularly Jewish way. In one sense, the Greeks might say, in unity there is strength. And Jews would tell a story about 2 dogs that beat a lion. Had 2 dogs beat a lion? Why did 2 dogs? All of that is commentary. But it's got a different power than in unity there is strength. Now, what are the 2 modern mechanisms of storytelling that we know? The first is the novel, which really is private and individual. And the second is a movie. What is the difference between a museum and a movie? I'm giving you Museum Now 101, Historical Museum 101. What is the difference between a museum and a movie? In a movie, you have a captive audience and collective, a captive audience and moving imagery. You come into a movie, you look at the screen, and for the period of time you're in that movie, as long as you pay attention, you're in the hands of the director. What is the difference between that and a museum? A museum has captive imagery and a moving audience. And consequently, if you want to move the people so they learn the story, there are either two methods. Let's contrast that with some of you may have been to my colleague's museum at the Simon Wiesenthal Center, at the Museum of Tolerance. They use one method that we reject. I'm not saying better or worse, I'm just saying we reject. Their method is to have you walk through the story by lighting certain areas, creating sound, and it's essentially you go through area 1, it then shuts down, and area 2 lights up, and your natural instinct is to go to area 2. We decided that it would be the power of narrative story that would move you from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6. And therefore we had to be prepared for everybody having a different experience, because people give different time to different images, to different writings, to different texts, to different films, to different things. So lots of people can go through the museum and they've seen very different things. Come out of the museum, you ask the question, what did you see? Now we have high points. Everybody who goes to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum remembers walking through the train. Everybody who goes to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum remembers walking to the model of the crematoria B2. Everybody who goes to the museum remembers a tower of faces of an entire village of Ashishki. And we did that in essence, and if I gave you, I just spoke to an architect who is designing a memorial. So he said, well, how do you work with an architect? In the ideal way, if you're designing a museum, you don't want the architect yet until you figure out what you're going to put in the museum. Form follows function. What's the function? What's the content? What do you need? And then you turn to an architect. It never works that way. Because the people who can afford to build museums are people who create things. And if, for example, if you create a real estate thing, you build an office building, then you look for tenants. You'll build an anchor store, and then you look to rent it to Macy's or to Nordstrom or to Kmart or to whatever have you, and you build it, and then they will rent it. So an architect creates a rhythm. In our case, in Washington, for example, the story occurred on 3 floors. Well, if it occurs on 3 floors, it doesn't take much brains to say, you got to decide whether you go up and walk down, or whether you walk up, you begin on floor 1. The one thing's for sure is you're not going to begin on floor 2 and have half the audience go up and half the audience go down. So we decided it's much easier to walk downstairs than upstairs, right? Not too much. Therefore, you begin, you go to the top, and you descend. Descend is a metaphor. You get deeper and deeper into the story. Second thing is, if the story is on 3 floors, gee, even I'm smart enough to figure out you want to shape the story in 3 acts. So that when you finish 1 floor, you're going to another theme, another topic, another way. And if you're descending, you want to get deeper into it. And then we decided that you would conclude the exhibition by being able to walk from the exhibition to the memorial. So we built the memorial to be right outside the exhibition. And therefore, we had the basic framework. By the way, it sounds easy in retrospect. We're arguing, we're yelling, we're screaming, we're throwing out bad design after bad design. I mean, that's part of the great creative process. Only in retrospect does it seem natural, and the reality is it should fit organically. You have to work with the rhythm of the architect in such a way that the thing fits organically. So that's how we developed the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, with the idea that we had to tell the story. How do you divide the story in 3 ways? Well, clearly the easiest way is to say 33 through 39. Then the Holocaust, which had major themes: ghettoization, mobile killing units, decision to kill, deportation to death camps, and then face-to-face with death. And then what do you do on the bottom floor? Well, everything you didn't cover on the other 2 floors, you resistance, rescue, death marches, liberation, and then the journey back, consequences. And then we had a problem: how do you conclude an exhibition? And we got an inspiration from a terrible New York detective series that only certain people here will remember, and I want the younger students, all the students, because this was a detective series of the 50s and early 60s. And you'll see something remarkable, which is some of us old folks will only remember one line from the whole detective series. The one line is it was a New York detective series. There were 8 million people in this city, 8 million stories, and this has been one of them. Right? Do you remember that? That's the only, you haven't thought of the Naked City in years, and that's the only thing you can remember of the Naked City. Can't tell you who the actors were, you can't. What was our idea was that the way to conclude was to listen to the survivors. And they would humanize the whole story, and they would tell their story in fragments and in pieces to touch on the themes, on the ambiguity of the themes, on the dilemmas of the themes, and they touch every topic and would give you fragment after fragment after fragment, with the idea that if you stayed there and listened for a very, very long time, you would begin to understand more and more and more. And then you'd get a very great paradox. The more you understood, the less you understood. Because the more interesting and the more perplexing it became. And that's the way in which we concluded. And that, ironically for me, transitioned me to my next position, which was that in the ideal world, we would have an endless film. But nobody can afford to make an endless film. And then what I decided that I would do after Steven Spielberg made his decision to commit to take moral histories was that I would go after survivors. Went to the Survivors of the Shoah Visual History Foundation, and we took 52,000 testimonies, 57 people, 32 languages. And we compiled a record of Holocaust testimony that's about 15 years to see, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Now obviously you can't present all of that in front of a museum, so you condense fragments, and that's how we concluded. But the largest point is that the museum tells the story, and the memorial gives you a physicality to remember and to get its implication. And we struggled with that also. One of the struggles is, what do you say? And I lost on this. I wanted us not to take classical biblical verses. I wanted us to take verses from the testament that was the testimony of the Holocaust. And my choice of that, which didn't get it, but I think I was right, but that doesn't mean you get it. My choice was a very important centerpiece. I have told you this story not to weaken you, but to strengthen you. Now it's up to you. And instead we have a couple of verses. One of them is a condensation from Deuteronomy. Remember what your eyes have seen, and teach them diligently to your children's and your children's children, which is the idea of remembering. And the paradox was I wanted not more than remembering, I wanted responsibility, but I didn't win, so we have classical, wonderful biblical verses. The other biblical verse we have in that hall of remembrance is, am I my brother's keeper? Which is about what? The first murder. And behold, I've given you goodness and evil, therefore life and death, therefore choose life so that you and your descendants may live. Not bad choices from the Bible. Much more difficult choices if you use something less sanctified, which is testament from the event itself.
I'm going to use the biblical reference there to take a bridge to the actual question that we're discussing tonight. This has been a great context that you've given us. The topic of our conversation is, why should Christian college students study the Holocaust? This implies a different question than why college students who happen to be Christians should study the Holocaust, because it points to a specific institutional, cultural, communal context in which that question should be addressed. I wonder if you could talk about both of these in terms of whether Christians have a distinctive responsibility to study the Holocaust, and if so, what is that? Where does that responsibility come from, and perhaps what biblical sources might inform that responsibility for Christians?
Terrific question. I deserve it. Remember, I told you that the Holocaust was perpetrated by educated men and, to a lesser extent, women. The Holocaust was also perpetrated by people who saw themselves as Christians. And consequently, Christianity has to ask itself the question, and every religion has to ask itself a different question. Christianity has to ask itself the question, what in our religion would allow people to, on one hand, conceive of themselves as Christians, and on the other hand, decide to eliminate this people? And eliminate in particular Jews, because the elimination of Jews deals with, in a very particular way, deals with a core element of Christianity. Remember, if you had studied St. Augustine, and this is not a Catholic institution, but when I taught at Georgetown, I could presume that all of my students who were graduates of Roman Catholic parochial schools had at least, I wouldn't say read or understood Augustine, but at least had heard and had a little bit of Augustine. I had wonderful training by Jesuits when I took my first philosophy course, so I broke my teeth on Augustine, and boy, you know, I learned Augustine, knew Augustine well. Augustine had an image of the Jew that would not allow their elimination. He said the Jew's task was to bear witness at the end of time that Christ has risen. Now the ultimate, and in fact, the great difference, he was very wise about this in an interesting way. The great difference between Judaism and Christianity is the answer to one question that the Messiah, when the Messiah returned, would answer. Is this your first trip or your second? And I don't mean this jokingly, I mean this very seriously. Is this your first trip or your second trip? By the way, it could be that it's the 35th trip and we've just never recognized it. And is your name Jesus? The answer to that question, who would be the wisest witnesses to accept Jesus, the return of Jesus? The Jews, who had had the opportunity to accept Jesus and had rejected him. But if you were an Augustinian, you could not kill all the Jews because nobody would be there at the end of the days to testify to the truth of your faith. Now, if you're a Christian, you have to ask yourself the question, and it's now a much larger question for the world today. You have to ask yourself the question, was the choice of the Jew as target for the full fury of Nazi venom, was the choice of the Jew as target related to Christianity? And if so, how do we reshape Christianity in such a way that we could not choose a people to be targeted as such? And how do we become Christians who reject this, and reject this deeply and profoundly, and could not perpetrate such a crime? Now, my friend Emil Falkenhayn, my late teacher, had a great image. Anybody have a piece of paper, because I want to illustrate it? No, just do, I don't want to use the blackboard, I want to show you. Emil Falkenhayn said the Holocaust was a rupture, an almost complete rupture in the heart of Western civilization with all its values. He said, let's take a look at philosophy. I already told you about Heidegger. There was a mediocre philosopher by the name of Kurt Huber, who taught his students, act as if on thee and thy deed depended the entire fate of Germany, and thou alone art responsible for it. His students, and he was teaching Immanuel Kant in a very simple way. His students became the White Rose, the only German group that directly confronted the final solution to the Jewish problem. So you could say that philosophy at its core had a rent, but there was a little thin pencil of a little philosopher upon whom one could build. Christianity. The perpetrators saw themselves as Christians. Hitler was never excommunicated, not even posthumously, from the Roman Catholic Church. I'm not saying Hitler was a Christian, I'm saying that he perceived himself, conceived himself. There was a pastor in Le Chambon by the name of André Trocmé. André Trocmé made the village of Le Chambon with his wife and his friends into a haven that rescued 5,000 Jews. He taught a very simple gospel. He ended his sermon every week. Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, with all thy might, with all thy soul, and love thy neighbor as thyself. Go practice it. So you saw on the one hand Christianity as failure, and on the other hand you saw Christianity as this awesome success. The Bishop of Denmark indicated in a public statement that Christians could not be involved in the final solution, had to stand by their fellow Jews. He was alone in lonely voice, but that again, that's the fragment on which to build. So what does Falkenhayn say? Falkenhayn says the post-Holocaust task is mending. You got to repair the rent in civilization. And those of you who have ever sewn anything, and most of you have not, but I did, those of you who have ever sewn anything have to recognize that the strongest part of a garment is where mending has taken place. The strongest part of a garment is where the mending has taken place. So what is the task of a Christian university? It's to create the type of Christians that would see themselves in the tradition of Trocmé and in the tradition of the Danish bishop, and not in the tradition of those who, or in the tradition of the confessing church, and not in the tradition of those who could go along and get along and, as it were, participate in the venom that was directed. Now, I want to tell you that I really believe that the single deepest religious issue of our time, bar none, is how can we maintain our fundamentalist traditions but embrace the other instead of demonize the other? the fate of the world may really depend on the answer to that question. Every religious tradition has something within it that allows it to embrace the other. And every religious tradition has something within it that allows it to denigrate and demonize the other. The question is, which part of that tradition do you emphasize? Which biblical verses do you turn to? Which fundamental values do you embrace? And how do you respond to that? Example, let me start with my own tradition. If we begin to emphasize the idea that all of us are the creation of the divine, then I have to recognize the divine spirit in you and the divine spirit in you. And I don't divide the world in Jews and Gentiles, the elect and the others, or whatever have you. I talk about the divine spirit, the divine creation that unites you and me, and in American terminology, the inalienable rights that we have endowed. We are endowed by our Creator. If I'm in Islam, I don't want to divide the world into Dar al-Islam and Dar al-Ara, into the world of Islam and into the world of the infidels. I want to emphasize the notion of the people of the book and the majesty of God's creation. Same thing goes within Christianity. And we have to develop these types of values and these types of Christians, Jews, and Muslims for us to embrace our faith, but also to recognize the other as entitled to absolutely fundamental elements. And that's why you have to understand the impact for Christianity very deeply, very profoundly, and very basically. And again, when I teach the Holocaust, I also teach the type of religious healing that has taken place in its aftermath. You know, a great example is Rome. I taught at Georgetown, so I obviously taught with regard to the Roman Catholic Church. The Roman Catholic Church in 1965 promulgated something called Nostra Aetate. And they began even to interpret the tradition in such a way as to de-emphasize the Jewish responsibility for the crucifixion. And they said, if Christ died for our sins, then it's not the Jews but human sin that is responsible for the crucifixion. No human sin, no need for the atoning repentance that was involved, for the sacrifice that was involved with the crucifixion of Jesus. And therefore, we don't have to demonize these Jews. We can think of it in a broader context, and they changed their ritual, they changed even their scriptural reading for Good Friday, and they no longer spoke about perfidious Jews. Great act of healing. 30 years later, the Pope, John Paul II, says something that, had it been said 70 years earlier, would have changed the entire world. He said anti-Semitism is anti-Christian. Now, he didn't write the script that I had prepared for him to write. I would have liked him to say some more, but the profundity of the statement, anti-Semitism is anti-Christian, is a great example. Now, what do we want from the other religion? We don't want a war of religions. If we do, then there's no possibility of compromise. What we want is to develop a religious tradition that respects, embraces, engages the other, rather than demonize the other. And we do have a choice as to what text we emphasize and to what text we transmit, even in the most fundamental of all teachings. And I begin with my own tradition. I'm not asking you to do anything that I don't ask my own tradition to do, because I can't ask that without reciprocity.
I want to talk for a minute about pitfalls in studying the Holocaust, beginning with my own. I came to a realization that most of my work was looking at the death and killing machine of Jewish people. So my study of the Holocaust was really about the killing of Jewish people and the killing of other people. And I came to the realization that this is a pretty depressing work. Not only that, many of my students, all they knew of a Jewish person was what they learned about dead Jewish people. And I'm here at Biola at the invitation of Judith Rude and the Jewish Studies organization, because I don't know if they meant it this way, but I'm bringing my realization to this campus, back to this campus, to say we're doing something different here because we are acknowledging the living reality, the legacy, the history, the rich cultural tradition, the rich religious tradition of Jewish people, of living Jewish people, of human beings. And so I'm wondering if there are other pitfalls in the study of the Holocaust that we should be aware of.
You've recognized one that's, all I can say to what you said is amen. But let me give it to you in the most deeply personal way. Before my late father died, he was in a coma for a couple of weeks. And the doctors he encountered when he was in a coma never knew him when he was living and vibrant, vital. When he was a commanding presence, they didn't know his smile, they didn't know his sense of humor, they didn't know him in the fullness of dignity. One of the things that we had to tell them is, this is not a lump on a bed. This is my father, this is my mother's husband, this is my grandchildren's grandparent, my children's grandparent. This was a man who had a certain majesty and vitality to him. So my rule is that before they were victims, they were people. And we have to understand them before. And then we also have to understand them after, because one of the great stories of Jewish history is the idea that in the aftermath of death and destruction, people recreated life. And survivors are symbols of resilience, not only anguish. What are some of the other pitfalls? One of the other pitfalls is you refuse to face the darkness. There is I could give it to you in theological terms, but one of the important things is the most truthful books written on the Holocaust face the darkness, go deep into that despair, and then find a way out. Another one of the pitfalls is to tell happy stories. You tell the story of survival, you tell the story of resistance, but resistance is a mixed story. If you tell the story of rescue, rescue is also a mixed story. For everybody who was rescued, there was somebody who wasn't. Or there was somebody who faked downward courage. So you have to be prepared to see the darkness. That's a pitfall. The other is to not understand the complexity of what you face. More than that, there's also the question of understanding the language that we use. We use ordinary terms. You know that Primo Levi says that we use certain words. Had the Lagers, Primo Levi, who's the great Italian Jewish writer who was in Auschwitz at precisely the same time as Elie Wiesel, said that had the Lagers, had the death camps lived a little bit longer, they would have created a language their own. Use the word hungry, it means you missed lunch. And when you leave here, you go have a bite. Use the word cold, it means you should have brought a sweater. They got hungry in 1941, they ate again in 45, and the meal that they ate in 45 very often killed them because their bodies could no longer digest. They got cold in October and they got warm in May, and every moment of every minute of every hour of every day, they had the type of cold that chills you to the very bone, and we use the same language. So you have to understand the unique language, and in that sense, you have to listen to the survivors tell you about it. I think another pitfall is overdramatization. When people come to me on films or on writing or on scripts, I say you don't have to add drama, you merely have to let the drama speak forth. And if the drama speaks forth, then you get the nature of the story in such a way without over-dramatizing it. Let me give you an example of over-dramatization. A Jewish example. Yad Vashem Yad Vashem is Israel's memorial to the Holocaust. It calls the rescuers the righteous among the nations of the world. That sounds stupendous. But the problem with that is that most of us, even those of us who are religious, don't aspire to be righteous. What we aspire to do is to be decent. In Yiddish, there's a great word, a mensch, a person. So if you say that what it took to rescue was to be righteous, then it puts it out of the ballpark. But if you listen to the survivors, the Danes who rescued their Jews said, we didn't do anything extraordinary. We immediately treated our neighbor the way you treat a neighbor when a hostile occupying army comes to kill them. The wife of the pastor of the Chambon, Mrs. Trachmey, said, you know how I got into the business of rescue? A 6-year-old came to my house, he was hungry. I fed him. Next day, 3 6-year-olds came, I fed them. When 50 kids showed up, I knew I needed help, so I turned to my neighbors. Am I a righteous person? No, I'm merely a woman who couldn't what? Who couldn't not feed a 6-year-old. Can you starve a 6-year-old? Either. So when we exaggerate, when we put it out of reach, we don't therefore give the implication that, you can be a rescuer. Let me give you another example. I interviewed a man by the name of Perlasca. And this was Perlasca's values. Perlasca was an Italian who was a fascist. Now, you begin to say an Italian fascist, and you say, no possibility of redemption. And yet, when he was in Hungary, he got himself pretending that he was a Spanish diplomat. And together with Raoul Wallenberg, he released Spanish safe passes. And we asked him, what was your motivation? He said, look, I didn't understand why you should kill somebody merely because they were of a different religion. I don't like Jews. I don't care for Jews. That doesn't mean he killed them. I had no quarrel with the Nazi form of government, but why should they kill people? Now, how do you call a guy like that righteous? But again, what was his motivation for rescue? Something within him screamed when human beings were being killed. So one of the pitfalls is exaggeration. Now again, you may have a terrible character flaw, which says that if I tell you it takes righteousness to be decent, not for me. But if I tell you that a flawed human being who had bad political views, who didn't mind making a buck off the war and everything else, but couldn't stand by when people were being killed, you say, hey, I'm better than that. I can do something to help somebody. And all of a sudden it becomes more accessible. That's another pitfall. And the other pitfall, which is very deep, and you saw this in your work, and everybody who's studied the Holocaust sees it. One of the things that I had when I was studying the killers was I had young children. And I would come out of the world of darkness and I would play on the floor with kids. And I would see the vitality of life of kids who don't know that the world's a horrendous place. And who really, get excited and dance and sing and jump and do all sorts of wonderful things. And therefore you have to be linked to life. as precisely you study this material, because this is dangerous material. And you got to understand that you don't study it without it psychologically reaching you. It reaches you in your dreams. It reaches you in your nightmares. Give you a simple thing. We work for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. According to government regulations, you're not allowed to drink at the government expense. You can't bill when you're traveling. You can't bill your bar bill. And we said anybody who wanted to drink could bill us for their bar bill after they've been to the camps. Right? We said we're ready to go to jail at the federal government when they do an audit, because we think that for those who drink, they gotta find a way to get out of the camps. And I, who never drink hard liquor, would have two good stiff drinks of vodka to get out of camps and wash that thing, right out of my soul. And if I had to go to jail for it, I was prepared to do it for myself and for anybody else. Meaning that there are times when you got to get rid of this stuff and compensate for the encounter with death by life. Same thing happens to doctors, same thing happens to people after trauma. You got to do something, and you got to balance death by life. Otherwise you go nuts.
We have one more question before we open it up to you, and maybe I'm asking this prematurely because maybe it should come at the very end, but you're here. First time here at Biola?
Yeah.
This could be step one for us and you.
Good.
Yeah. Do you have a recommendation for step two?
Let's talk about that. Question is, what do I, students can really deal with that. What do I have to share that you want to learn?
This is a good opportunity to take questions.
Well, if you're not going to take questions, then I'm going to take a drink.
Well, I have a question for you, students. So, Biola claims to have how many students?
6,000.
Yeah. And we have less than 50 here. This is one, my math is terrible.
No, 1/100.
1/100. Yeah, thank you. I'm always bad on zeros. All right, so why is that? I am so thankful that you're here. Why did you come? And why should you, if you're here, what would you say to students who didn't come? I'm interested in knowing. I don't know the answers. Does anyone have any thoughts?
That it was 2 hours well spent.
Say that again?
That it was 2 hours well spent.
It
And
was-
I'm glad I came.
And that's why you came?
Well,
Because
my
it's
history teacher informed me of it.
I once had a teacher who never took attendance. And he had a wonderful line that he always said. He said, "I'll never take up the time of those who are present to worry about those who are absent." It's a good point. And his idea was, he said, "Look, if you don't think I have anything to say to you, don't come. And if you can do the exam at the end, the paper and the exam without learning from me, be my guest. But I'm not going to take up the time of those who are present to worry about those who are absent." The reality is you have to build, and you have to build slowly. And you got to cherish those of you who brave this. Let's ask some questions, guys.
What were some alterations made to church doctrine in Nazi Germany to make this more possible? Because were there any?
The more important question is not what alterations were made in church doctrine, as to what emphasis were made in church doctrine. Because church doctrine, look, I'm a student of religion, so part of what, in all religions, including mine, part of what you do is you choose what to emphasize and what to de-emphasize. Germany developed the idea that the church was a national church. And there is a way in which when you see the church must always have a certain type of church synagogue, must always have a certain type of wary reaction to the state. It's got to be part of and apart from, it's got to be a little bit critical, and it's got to be prepared to be a little bit antithetical and a little bit challenging, as well as embracing. And it got caught up in a wave of enormous nationalism, which was also caught up in a wave of those who are not us are other. And it divided the world into us and them. And religions fully have the capacity to divide the world into us and them without the bridging that was there. It, for example, tried to do something else which was virtually impossible. It tried to read the Jews out of the Bible. And when it read the Jews out of the Bible, there wasn't a hell of a lot left. Developed the notion of the Aryan Jesus. You know, Jesus lived as a Jew, he taught as a Jew, he died as a Jew. He thought of himself as a Jew. You got a hell of a convoluted Christianity thinking of Jesus as an Aryan. But again, lots of societies reshape Jesus in their own image. You look at Jesus in certain portraits, look at Jesus in other artistic portraits, and there's a proximity to their own tradition by the way in which Jesus is portrayed. And consequently, you tried that in a very particular way. One of my teachers, Martin Buber, let me add this in a very particular way. There was a philosophical book called Persecution and the Art of Writing by Leo Strauss. And Leo Strauss did a very interesting intellectual exercise. It says before you read what a person wrote, you have to ask yourself, what were they capable of saying in the society in which they lived? And therefore you have to think of their writing as a puzzle if they lived in a society that was less than free. And the puzzle is, what could you get away with saying, and then how do you write it? There's a very particular essay by Martin Buber written in the 1930s in Germany called On the Question of the Single One. Martin Buber was a great Jewish philosopher. And he wrote a long, convoluted essay on Soren Kierkegaard, the great Protestant thinker. And if you read it, what he did was he pleaded against idolatry by talking on what is ostensibly a commentary on Kierkegaard's writing, in the hopes that there would be those who would read Kierkegaard who would understand precisely what the political situation required and what type of courage it required and what type of sacrifice it required. And Kierkegaard himself sacrificed, as it would, dealt with the sacrifice of Isaac and sacrificed love and his fiancée and all of that in order to remain faithful in his own image. And Buber spoke only about Kierkegaard, but anybody who reads this understands that part of Buber's critique was that the church had become idolatrous. Idolatrous to the state, idolatrous to race, and it had failed to do its job. Let me give you another example. Rabbi Leo Beck wrote a commentary for Yom Kippur 1936, Day of Atonement, the holiest day of the year. And what he did was to paraphrase a prayer which every Jew who frequented synagogue, several times a year would know. You didn't have to be quite knowledgeable to understand it. But a Gestapo agent who had never been in synagogue would not quite recognize. So he said, we bow our head and we bend our knees and we bow our head before the King of Kings, the Holy One, blessed be He. And the reason the King of Kings is because when that prayer was written, one of the kings called himself the King of Kings. So how do you say God is the King is not the King of Kings, the King of Kings, right? Yup, the ante. The Holy One, blessed be He. And then he added a very interesting line, but we stand erect before man. And anybody who heard that prayer said he's saying something. And it didn't take much imagination for somebody to understand what he was saying. You can bow down before God, but not before these people who are pretending to be God. And sometimes people I'll give you another example which is less philosophical, but more practical, but shows you how you use language to communicate in a certain particular way. October 1943, the Danish Jews were going to be deported. The rabbi of the largest synagogue in Denmark had advanced knowledge of this, and it was the week before the High Holy Days, when the synagogues are more packed than usual. High Holy Days were going to begin Monday night, Tuesday, and Wednesday. And he got up and he made an announcement. He said, the cantor and I have just had a long talk, and we decided that we hadn't taken a sufficient vacation this summer, and we're going to go to the seashore. Therefore, there'll be no services on Monday night, Tuesday, or Wednesday. Make your own arrangements. And didn't say another word. Congregation listening to that scratched their head, and the first thing they said is, did you hear what I heard? The rabbi and the cantor are not going to show up for the High Holy Days? They're going on vacation at the seashore? Can't quite be. Were they trying to tell us something? What were they trying to tell us? And you have to imagine that the telephones and the conversations in the streets, because telephones were dangerous, but walking in the street, before everybody could record everything in every conceivable way, walking in the street was still a little bit more open. You've got to imagine everybody was trying to parse out what the rabbi had said. And everybody knew for sure that he couldn't say what was fully on his mind because he was living what? With Gestapo agents listening to his every word. And consequently, that's the way in which he warned his congregation. So everything anybody wrote during this period of time has to be read a little bit as a detective story. What could you say? And how close could you go to saying what you wanted to say without what? Without going over the line. And anybody who's ever lived in a totalitarian society will always tell you that the people who know how to figure out in between, how to read in between, get a lot of information in that particular way. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What was your personal journey to becoming a Holocaust scholar? What drove you to this area?
Terrific question. I can give you the short story, I can give you the long story. If you email me, I'll send you the article I wrote. Because I was asked to write that. And it was interesting because my first draft on that ended up being 120 pages. And I was raised in the post-war world. And I was raised in an Orthodox community. I was raised in a Hebrew-speaking day school. But the Hebrew-speaking day school that I was raised in taught us Shakespearean Hebrew. I'll give you an example of what a Shakespearean Hebrew was. When I came to Israel the first time and asked for directions, I said in Hebrew, "If your heart inclineth in my direction, would you kindly indicate to me, thy humble servant, what is the proper path upon which one should tread to reach his anointed destination?" You have to imagine that they asked me to repeat it on the bus, and the bus was laughing far greater than this. It was like I had arrived from another world. And I had made a terrible mistake, and those of you who studied Hebrew will know the mistake. Modern Hebrew makes a distinction between to know and to be acquainted with. And I would speak a classical Hebrew, and I would say, I know him, and I know her, and I know them, and it looked like I had been the most promiscuous person in the history of the world. But I was using Hebrew correctly. They were using Hebrew in the way in which we speak English, right? Nobody says, "Methinks the lady doth protest too much." So my teachers would roll up their sleeves and they would have a number on it. We didn't know what it meant. We knew that Judaism didn't allow you to tattoo your body. And the only experiences we had with numbers, we had two experiences with writing numbers. One is, if you wanted to cheat on an exam, you wrote some answers on your arm and you used a long shirt and left it up. You guys wouldn't do that, but some people would do that. And the other is when you finally got the courage to ask that young lady out and you needed her number, and then you realized you were in deep trouble because you didn't have a piece of paper. So what you do, you'd write her number on your hand, and then you wash your hand a little bit later and you try to figure out what you blurred, and then your great date would go out the window. We were told words, camps, death, children, and what we were taught was something else which was very interesting. We were taught that we were to make up for a world that was destroyed, but never told why, never told why. And I grew up in an environment where some of my friends were children of survivors. I once invited one of my best friends to go to camp with me. He went home, made a terrible mistake because he translated camp into Yiddish, and he said I was inviting him to lager. Lager was concentration camp or death camp. His father called up my father and screamed for an hour before my father understood what it was about and said, look, camp meant swimming and baseball and basketball and dancing and girls and, outdoors and not a sweaty, hot New York summer before they had air conditioning. So all of a sudden that, and I also grew up in a synagogue that was composed primarily of German Jews who had escaped to America in 38, 39, 40. German and Belgian Jews who were, many of them were in the diamond business, and the reason they could escape is because they had portable wealth. In other words, if you have diamonds, you have portable wealth. Let's assume you're a great real estate magnate, you can't sell your property. Let's assume even you have lots of cash, you need suitcases for cash. Diamonds, you can stash 2 pocketfuls and walk out with a fortune. You can, put it in plastic or whatever have you. So I grew up without understanding this, and I was working on a doctorate on a very interesting question. Why did the Jews not get defeated? Not go out of business after defeat? There are plenty of ancient civilizations that went out of business after they were defeated. And if you go to ancient languages, there are multiple ancient languages that have no living community with it, you have all sorts of destruction. I was interested in what's the mystery of survival. Somebody came up to me and said, hey, you're not asking an ancient question, you're asking a modern question. I said, don't bother me, I'm an ancient historian. He said, read this book. I started reading Holocaust literature, and I realized that I really was asking a contemporary question, looking back in the ancient world to find the answer, and I found Holocaust literature unendingly interesting. And consequently, I kept with it. And then I did my doctorate on the theological issues reflecting the Holocaust. And I wrote a book called The Vision of the Void, which is how do you deal with absence, with void, how do you deal with loss and the magnitude of it, and where do you find God in its aftermath. And then I professionally got this incredible opportunity to work. So the one thing I bemoan is that people now primarily ask me about the Holocaust, and I was widely trained in all sorts of areas of Jewish scholarship and Jewish learning. And it's been years since people have asked me to speak about something else. In fact, one of the reasons I did the encyclopedia was I thought, oh my God, after that they'll ask me to speak about something other than the Holocaust. And they don't. And I, being a very good ancient historian, not very good, being a promising ancient historian, I used to say that I will speak about sex in Judaism, and everybody would attend in large numbers, and then I'd speak about the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and the audience would come away a little bit disappointed. So that's the journey. But I am an American born to American parents. And in fact, my parents' generation was deeply engaged in the process of Americanization. They were the first to speak English, they were the first to go to school in America, they were the first to do, all sorts, first to go to college, first to do all sorts of things. For them, Americanization was absolutely key. My parents had multiple names, which then became Americanized. End up being Saul and Rhea. So it was, I came back to world they lost. Now, taking a long thing, what did I accomplish in certain respects? I brought into the American world of my parents, you and everybody else, what had been communicated to me in silence and could not be told me. And then the second part of my career was to give my survivors the possibility of leaving a permanent record. And that in one sense, part of what you look for in life is a question that you can answer, why were you created? What the hell difference does your life make? And I've been privileged to, find an answer for that. And though I'm deeply committed to living, if I had to meet my maker, I would be prepared to say, you gave me X, Y, and Z talents, this is what I've done with them. And that's a tremendous feeling. Now, I give you the problem with it. I had, in my 40s, I had done everything I imagined trying to do, had a humongous success, was too poor and too young to retire. So what do you do after you've done everything you wanted to do? Gotta find another hill, another mountain, another challenge, and try it. But, had I been 65, 70, I could have said, okay, build it up. Go out with one more. But I was too young. And I didn't own shares in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. And I'm happy I didn't own shares in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Nobody should own shares in the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum. Good question. Somebody in the back had their hand up.
I did, yeah. With the growing anti-Semitism in the Middle East and in Europe, and with the tendency for the secular world to kind of
Let's begin by saying a couple things. First of all, terrific question. I have a very simple view. America that maintains American values can do many terrible things, couldn't commit a Holocaust. What's the greatness of American national values? We have the idea of checks and balances. We have restraint on the power of government. We have a separation between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislative. And we have this incredibly wonderful notion of the inalienable rights of human beings to life, liberty. I'm less concerned with the pursuit of happiness, but life and liberty are pretty good. I mean, I don't mind happiness, but I understand what that means. But in terms of if I wanted to teach values, the idea that all men are created in the image of God, were endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, life and liberty, that's pretty good. I mean, I'm a believer in key and core American values. Let's talk for a moment about anti-Semitism. We'll give you the answer in a different way. I wrote a book called Not Your Father's Anti-Semitism, in which I said that it's a book I didn't want to write and one I thought would never be necessary. If you lived in 1993, you would say anti-Semitism was dramatically on the decline, and Israel was then going to seek peace, was about to sign peace and sign peace with the PLO, and anti-Semitism was at an all-time low. And not only was anti-Semitism on an all-time low, but it looked like, anti-Semitism was a problem of the past, not the future. What's happened since then is a very interesting thing. Number one, many of the dramatic themes of anti-Semitism that have been rejected in post-Holocaust Europe have migrated to the Middle East. Key elements include the Russian forgery of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, something that was created by the Russian secret police in the early 1900s, has all of a sudden made its way to the Middle East, and not only that, became a 41-part television series in Egypt, and had that migration. Another example, when the Syrian president received Pope John Paul II in 2001, he said, "Join with me against the Christ-killing, Mohammed-bashing Jews." Syrian President Bashar Assad was London trained. I mean, we're seeing the gruesome side of him now, but he then was the hope of the Middle East. London trained, married to a very sophisticated woman, and the like, and he had no realization that John Paul had dedicated, as John Paul II dedicated his life to getting rid of the notion of Jews as Christ killers. Third example is the blood libel. The blood libel makes no theological sense in Islam. It makes some theological sense in Christianity. What is the blood libel? The idea that the way in which Jews make Passover is to slaughter an innocent Christian child and use the blood to bake the matzah. No, truth, we don't drink blood, we don't slaughter, all of that, and matzah cannot have blood, it's got to, etc. But in Christianity, what is the central sacrament? Central sacrament is of the Eucharist. In Roman Catholic is of the Eucharist, and you say, "This is my body, this is my blood." And if you really believe in transubstantiation, you really believe that you are eating the body and eating the blood. And therefore it makes some convoluted theological sense to say that the way to redeem is the slaughter of the innocent. No such thing in Islam. Why does it make it there? It was introduced in 1840 by Catholic priests in Damascus and the like, and part of what we have is a politicalization and a migration to anti-Semitic themes, and that's also making its way back into Europe, because what you have is you have anti-Semitism in Europe being imported with its Muslim populations who are in the country but not of the country. Now, in France, the phenomenon is very simply, you have in excess of 6 million Muslims living in France who are in France but not of France. If you are of France, you accept liberty, equality, and fraternity. And anti-Semitism in France increased, not in response to anything happening in France, but to events that were happening in the Middle East. And the same thing is true all over the place. Consequently, we have a situation in which there is significant anti-Semitism, but ironically not in America. Now, in America, I'll tell you the opposite is the case. Jews right now are the least unpopular and consequently the most popular of all the religions. If you look at something called microtrends. Now, microtrends are very interesting. We live in a very complex world. In the old days, there was only Coke. Then there was Coke and Tab. Then there was Coke Diet, Coke and Tab. Now there's Coke and Coke Zero, caffeine-free and non-caffeine-free. There's Cherry Coke and Vanilla Coke, Lime Coke and Lemon Coke, both of Coke and of thing, because what happens is you segment the market. Now, in terms of that, Judaism is right now the least unpopular and therefore, ironically, the most popular of all the religions. You know that there's some antagonism to evangelical Christianity. There's some anger at mainstream Protestant Christianity. There's a good deal of disquiet with the Roman Catholic Church, even among Roman Catholics, most especially with the hierarchy and a whole range of things taking place. Nuns are at war with priests over a whole range of political issues, and the whole issue of, and the antagonism to Islam runs very deep in America, and Jews become the least unpopular, consequently the most popular. Now, and the other thing is that I've shown this in my own work since the 1990s, that some of the anti-Semitic myths that you had could have been, in the late 1980s, there was something called the banking crisis. We had it in 2000 again, but you had the banking crisis, the savings and loan crisis. Savings and loans did not have adequate resources to pay off their depositors. And you had a period of time in which savings and loans went out of business. One savings loan in Maryland could only give you $250 of your own money in any given week. Now that meant if, God forbid, you had a family emergency and you had saved, you were in trouble without a paddle. If you wanted to buy a house, if, God forbid, you had a medical crisis, if you needed to buy a car, all you could get of your own money was $250. You would think that the fury would be enormous if that happened. The head of one of those banks was a man by the name of Jerome Carden, whose wife was the chairman of the Conference of Presidents of Major American Jewish Organizations. First of all, I'll tell you a secret, no Jewish organization claims to be a minor one. So the Conference of Presidents of Major Jewish Organizations contains many minor Jewish organizations, because nobody wants to say, I'm head of a minor Jewish organization, right? So, you know, that's a secret you should know, so you're a little bit less what you're but so one could have imagined that his wife would be perceived as the head of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, the most powerful woman, Jewish woman in American Jewish life. Very interesting thing happened. We kept surveying that. So 93% of the population regarded Jerome Carden as a corrupt banker. 7% of the population regarded Jerome Carden as a corrupt Jewish banker. They correlated with a lot of anti-Semitic beliefs. 100% of the Jews regarded Jerome Carden as a corrupt Jewish banker. They were embarrassed by him because of what he represented and what he seemed to represent to us. Jews there could have been a source of anti-Semitism within America in all sorts of times during economic, and hatred increases during times of economic dislocation. Part of what we've seen is the polarization of our society. Part of what we've seen is anger at immigrants who are taking, quotation marks, American jobs. And part of what we see is looking for a scapegoat. Wall Street versus Main Street, etc. Most remarkable thing is none of that's turned against the Jews. And if I'm pessimistic, I'd say turned against the Jews yet. And that's despite the prevalence of certain Jewish names in the economic life of American society. Alan Greenspan was the head of the Federal Reserve. He was replaced by Ben Shalom Bernanke, two Jewish guys. Now, one of them has been, working to repair the damage done under the watch of the other. But it's extraordinary that we haven't seen that. So I'm not worried about a repetition of the Holocaust. And in the Jewish community, I play a very particular and sometimes an unpopular role, which is some of my colleagues say it's 1933 or it's 1938. And sometimes you hear, for example, that Iran is threatening the next Holocaust. And what I say is, no, folks. Iran is threatening, but to claim that it's 33 or 38, and you even heard the prime ministers talk about withdrawal to the borders of 67 as withdrawal to the borders of Auschwitz. And I say, look, how many troops did the Jews have at Auschwitz? How many tanks, how many bullets, how many guns, how many rockets, how many planes? The truth is the Jews were radically powerless, and that led to their vulnerability. The state of Israel and what it's achieved, and even the power that the American Jewish community has, would not permit it to go in precisely the same direction. That doesn't mean it's not dangerous. But the difference between now and then is if Iran attacks Israel, they can be virtually certain of what we used to call mutual assured destruction, which in a rational world should mean that they shouldn't attack Israel and we shouldn't attack them. That's what worked with the Soviet Union. The one unknown equation in that is when we had the standoff in 1962, and I was old enough in 1962 to remember that. We had the standoff between John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev. Kennedy may have theoretically believed in the afterlife, but he was having a pretty good time in this life. And no, I mean that seriously. He had, he had wealth, he had power, he had beauty, he had women. I mean, pretty good time for him. And Khrushchev had no theoretical reason to believe in an afterlife. Consequently, both of them had to find a way off the precipice. We don't know what it means when you have religious leadership in a nuclear age that seriously believes in the afterlife, and whether that makes them suicidal in this life. There's a very, very slight reason for optimism when one of the Ayatollahs said it would be antithetical to our religious values to use nuclear weapons. Now, I hope that everybody else shares that value, but I doubt that they do. But mutual assured destruction, when one group deeply believes and profoundly, and let's take them seriously, believes in afterlife, is frightening because there's no deterrence against people who want to commit suicide, as we've seen in our world. Who could have imagined an airplane as a propelled rocket, except people who are willing to commit suicide? And years ago, President Bush was wrong. They're not cowards by any definition of the word cowardice because they're willing to die. So anti-Semitism, I wrote this book profoundly and deeply reluctantly. I argued that we have to recognize the trends of anti-Semitism. We have to see how it's not the anti-Semitism in the 1930s, and it's really not your father's anti-Semitism. That doesn't mean it's not present, doesn't mean it's not danger. It means it's different. And this is a case where not viva la différence. It's a different story. Other questions? Yes, sir.
I see the church in the Middle East coming under great pressure from Islam, from leaders, violence. And the church found that replacement theology politically is good as a way to show a Muslim world that we sympathize with.
I didn't hear the last half a sentence.
The church is trying to show the Muslim leaders around them by embracing the replacement theology. It's actually helping the church and helping the pressure of the decrease. As a result, we see many Muslims are coming to Christianity, coming to the church, because the first thing we deal with is what they think about Israel, Jews, and where they stand. So I see replacement theology in the Middle East really sweeping the church. And I wonder if this is going to be a downfall of the church in the Middle East.
You know, we view what's happening to the church in the Middle East a little bit different. I view it a little bit differently. The largest migration out of the Middle East has been of Christians. And that is that you now have a significant migration out of the Middle East of Christians. The only place in the Middle East where the Christian population is stable, ironically, is in Israel. But you've had a massive migration of Christians from Lebanon. You've had significant challenges to Coptic Christianity in Egypt. And you've had very few other places in which Christianity has found a hospitable, hospitable environment. So it's interesting to see what's happening in the Middle East with regard to that. Now, in the Middle East, you have some who are speaking of a replacement theology, but that's not leading to a flocking of Muslims to the church. What you're having instead is a profound type of fundamentalism taking place within Islam, without the moderation that comes from the confrontation with modernity, and also without the very wonderful sense. You know, America introduced a tremendous concept to the world, which is civility and interreligious discourse. In that sense, the transformation can be seen in the Roman Catholic Church. But there's a way in which, in the public sphere, we are civil. And we've all benefited from that. And that became a dramatic part of the American experience. Not true in other spheres of the world, and not necessarily that's a triumph, as it were, of certain types of American values versus certain types of trends within the religions themselves. Even very fundamentalist notions of religion have been Americanized. You know, if I were talking about, let's take in Judaism, you have a very interesting thing. Some of you know the group that's called Chabad. Now, when I give a lecture in business school, for example, I talk about how Chabad are the most Americanized of all the Jewish religious groups, and everybody looks at me like I'm crazy. I may be crazy, but that's not evidence for it. Why is Chabad the most Americanized? It replaced charismatic leadership with management. It used the legacy of the charismatic leader as a guarantee of quality. And I don't mean this pejoratively, I mean it descriptively. Its use of the Rabbi figure with the beard and the shiny, deep, intense eyes is a guarantor of the product, much like the use of the Colonel in Kentucky Fried Chicken. And I don't mean that pejoratively. I'm saying that's the way in which they've marketed the whole thing. They even use the media successfully, even though they're not supposed to have television and the temptation of that type of culture. So you have to say, how does a group use the media and have a telethon when they're not supposed to even watch television? And part of that is because they developed something that is absolutely remarkable, that violates every law of the world, which is they sent missionaries out to the world to change the world, but not to be changed by the world. Now, why does it violate every sense of it? Because in Hawaii, you'll hear a very great line about the original Hawaiian missionaries. They came here to do good, and they ended up doing very well. And there is a difference. Right? They came here to do good, and they ended up doing very well. And the reason Chabad can go out to the world and be trusted to go out into the world is because they transform but are not transformed. Now that's very different than most other groups that go out to the world that engage in dialogue and are transformed by the dialogue. But it's an interesting phenomenon to observe. Let's do one final thing. Let's take all the questions that are left, and I'll give you one set of answers. So we'll end at 9 o'clock, so that the student in the back who said it's 2 hours well spent won't say it's 2 hours and 5 minutes well spent. Anybody else?
For many years, I had the impression, or seemed to be internalizing the impression that particularly during the Holocaust, that the Jewish people were very compliant. But you made a statement about I'm recalling exactly, something to do with what sounded like a degree of potency that counterbalanced that. And we see that perhaps, at least I think of seeing that perhaps in the ghetto, Polish ghetto.
Yeah, let me talk about that. There's a historian by the name of Werner Rings who said that there are 4 types of resistance, 3 of them before armed resistance. One is called symbolic resistance. The other is polemical resistance. The third is self-help, and only then armed resistance. We don't generally think of all of the other forms as forms of resistance. What is symbolic resistance? Symbolic resistance means that you do something that resists the will of the oppressor. The oppressor wants to deny you your religious integrity, you pray clandestinely, you study clandestinely. In Theresienstadt, they wanted to kill the kids, but the kids were educated, and they had drawings in which they did the drawings of the art as a way of expressing themselves. In Auschwitz, Primo Levi talks about the man who washed his clothes in putrid water, and another who used glass to shave, to preserve the scaffolding of civilization, not to get clean. Not to get clean, you couldn't get clean, but to remind himself what? That there once was a time which was clean. I just interviewed a very religious man who told the story. He said, look, during the entire week, I ate anything that they put in front of me. Anything. And he was a man who would observe dietary laws. He said, but on Sabbath, I ate only bread, because I want to remember there was such a thing as Sabbath. There's polemical resistance. Polemical resistance is when you take a verbal step to oppose the enemy. Let me give you, I'll do this at a risk, but you gotta understand this. And I just spoke on this the other day. Easy forms of polemical resistance. Underground newspapers were published. Diaries were kept. Letters were written. Stuff was smuggled out. Different point of resistance was, I look at humor as a form of polemical resistance. My favorite joke. Kid in the Warsaw Ghetto was asked, what would you like most of all if you were Hitler's son? Answers immediately, to be orphaned. Now, by saying that, he's able in his imagination to kill Hitler. He doesn't ask for Mercedes, doesn't ask for a meal, doesn't ask for a beautiful home. He's able in his imagination to kill Hitler. That's a form of polemical resistance. Another example, 1930s, two Jews are reading two different newspapers. One a Jewish newspaper, the other the Nazi newspaper, Der Stern. One Jew turns to the other and says, Chaim, how can you read such garbage? Yankel, how can you read such garbage? He says, what do you mean? He says, I read the Jewish newspaper. Things are terrible. We're impoverished. We're being persecuted. Laws are being passed. And everything is going against us. Our future is bleak. Our life is horrendous. And the world's falling apart. I read their Sturmer. I realize that Jews are enormously powerful, that we control the presidency of the United States with Franklin Delano Rosenfeld. That we speak into the ear of the Pope and we have all the money in the world. Why would you read your newspaper when you read mine? And again, part of that is polemical resistance. Self-help. There were all sorts of ways in which Jews engaged in self-help. And, you know, I met a guy who was a wonderful forger. Raoul Wallenberg produced something called the Schutzpass. Wallenberg produced hundreds, and this guy and his forging team produced thousands. And then they distributed them, and therefore they had one document, they copied it, but they didn't copy it on a copier, they copied it by making documents look alike. That was one of the elements of self-help. What is armed resistance? Armed resistance for the Jews tended to be a last stand. Meaning that you didn't have the power to defeat the enemy and you understood that the enemy was going to kill you, but you made a decision not how to live, but how to die. And therefore, the only time you could engage in armed resistance was when you knew you were going to die. Now, when I said that, I once spoke in a room and a great man stood up. I didn't know he was in the room, who was the commandant of the Warsaw Ghetto, and he says, Berenbaum, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. He said, you know what resistance was? It was how to live as a free man until you died. Because once you decided to resist with arms, you had hours or days or minutes in which you lived in freedom and without fear, because you could go out and do the... Now, why did Jews not engage in armed resistance? Number one, this wasn't the way in which Jews had historically behaved. Took a revolution, the Zionist revolution, to see Jews with guns. Right? Israeli soldiers have guns, therefore they fight, they know how to do it, but that's a revolution in Jewish history. The other reasons for that was because as long as you thought you were going to live, or as long as you had even a glimmer of hope that you were going to live, you understood that this was the last stand. And consequently, you were afraid of endangering other people if you had a child at home. A wonderful story of a resistance fighter. Let's take a very simple example. Man was Abba Kovner, great Israeli poet. A resistance fighter and a general in Israel's 48 war. Told the story, he was in Vilna going out to fight in the woods. And he said, I wake up in the middle of the night, I ask, am I a great hero of the resistance? Am I a man who brought the Germans to their knees on a couple of occasions? Am I a general of the Israeli army? Am I a great poet? Or am I the biggest piece of scum on earth? And he said the following, when I went to say goodbye to my mother turned to me and said, what's to become of me? My son, don't leave your widowed mother to die alone. As then I left my mother's home to escape to the woods to fight, she screamed at me, my son, don't let your widowed mother, don't leave her alone, don't leave her to die alone. He said, and I can still hear her screaming. So what am I? The reality, he said, is I'm both. But you had to be able to tell your widowed mother that she was dead already. And not many people have that courage. Now take that and forget about a widowed mother who's old. Ask yourself if you could abandon your son, your daughter. Father's place is with the son and daughter to protect them. Can you abandon your wife? Can a wife abandon her children? And then realize what it took to engage in this final act of resistance. And remember, Jews resisted earlier than any other nation, any other group in Europe. Why? For a very interesting reason, because they were operating under a different timetable. Jews only had until deportation to operate. And deportation occurred in 42 and 43. And therefore, Jewish passivity is only when you understand what the unique circumstances were of that situation. And it's a much more complex reality. Polemical resistance, symbolic resistance, polemical resistance, self-help, only then armed resistance, and that was universally throughout every theater of the war and every theater of German occupation. Thank you very much.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.